A hoof tapped against the window panes. It was 4 in the morning and Fluttershy was standing outside of Apple Bloom's bedroom window. Her eyes were blank and her smile was slight enough to go virtually unnoticed. As Apple Bloom turned her head towards the window, Fluttershy raised a hoof and tapped against the glass again. She mouthed out 4 words. Her mouth could be barely moving. "It's cold out there here." Apple Bloom pulled the covers over her head. As she listened to the creaks and groans of the house settling, it would soon be dawn soon. The tapping started again. Fluttershy was standing outside of the window again. Her eyes didn't look quite right, but Apple Bloom would have been at loss if asked to describe how. The dark red stain across the left side of Fluttershy's face contrasted harshly with her normally bright fur. She again tapped on the glass, again mouthed out the 4 words. "It's cold out here." It was not cold. If anything, it was an unusually warm spring night. Apple Bloom pulled the covers up to her muzzle. A part of her wanted to keep the window open and let Fluttershy in, yet there was a whisper at the back of her young mind. No. Some part of Apple Bloom's brain said, "Do not open the window." So she merely sat there, staring into Fluttershy's slightly off eyes. Sleep seemed to be a remote possibility, and eventually it came. Apple Bloom dozed off just as the tapping stopped. That night, Apple Bloom dreamed of toys, merely not toys in general, but familiar plush or wooden faces of her childhood. She saw the wooden dolls Granny Smith had given her, and the hand-me-downs from Big Macintosh and Applejack were also there. Although they looked dingier than Apple Bloom remembered, she found herself digging through what seemed to be an unending pile of toys. "What am I looking for?" Apple Bloom wondered. Apple Bloom decided a minute later that it must be King Paws, her favorite teddy bear. She remembered loving him immensely when she was a foal, but why couldn't she find him? Surely he must have been somewhere. Surely this relic of Apple Bloom's foalhood was not easily buried. But King Paws hadn't been buried, hadn't he? He had gone missing. He had vanished from her one spring night, and Apple Bloom had never been quite the same since. Without this realization, Apple Bloom started to sob. This rush of emotion yanked out of her dream. Fluttershy was standing outside of the window again. Clutched in her mouth was a tattered old teddy bear. Apple Bloom slept in Applejack's bed that night. She made up some excuse about nightmares, horribly unaware of how immature she sounded. But her big sister was more than willing to switch bedrooms for the night. And of course Apple Bloom could not tell her the real reason why she was distraught. Laying in bed, Apple Bloom started to think about her foalhood for some reason. She recalled the bright eyes peering out from an open wardrobe, shadows slinking across the floor, a husky sigh as she approached sleep. But those were not memories, were they? Surely they were simply remnants of remained of past bad dreams. Applejack complained about having a headache the next morning, but otherwise none was worse for wear. Apple Bloom was alone in the house. Her siblings and her grandmother had left the premises, the former due to a last-minute order and the later due to some business with a distant relative. They would not be back until late the next day. Prior to the bed, Apple Bloom locked all the doors and windows of the house. She made a bed for herself on the living room couch. As one final precaution, Apple Bloom took an old garden hoe from the barn and she laid it right next to the makeshift bed within Hoof's reach. It was raining outside. Apple Bloom listened to the raindrops splattering against the roof as she dozed off. Occasionally she was convinced that she heard something else. A footstep? A bang? A whisper? No, it was her imagination. Or perhaps the wind. Apple Bloom snuggled up deeper under the blanket. More noises, they sounded as if they were coming from her bedroom, but that was impossible. The window was closed, but was it closed? Apple Bloom sat up, her heart pounding. She thought of locking her down the house, had been though, but she hadn't intentionally avoided her bedroom. Trusting the window would be closed, yet any pony in her family could have opened it prior to their leaving. Even more noises, banging and perhaps footsteps. As Apple Bloom Bloom was now certain that they were coming from her room. She clutched her blanket, quivering. What was she to do? Investigate? Flee? But what if it really was her imagination and the window was firmly shut? If so, stepping out of the house might put her in even more danger. Apple Bloom threw off the blanket and dropped to the floor. She had to know. Perhaps she was trotting to her own death, but it was better than simply waiting for some unknown horror to grab her. Apple Bloom took the garden hoe from in her mouth before she headed upstairs. The house was silent, but Apple Bloom was not fooled. She approached her bedroom with caution. A part of her expected the door to be flying open with some awful creature ready to pounce, but having a weapon of sorts made Apple Bloom feel brave enough to gently push the door open without hesitation. The window was open. The wind was now practically howling. It was slapping sheets of rain and leaves into the room. Judging by the twigs and leaves that had accumulated under the window, it had been open for a while. But the open window was not that part that made Apple Bloom pause. It was not the cause of that scream that climbed halfway up her throat. She saw it within seconds, and once she did, Apple Bloom thanked Celestia that she had not stepped into the room. Something was in Apple Bloom's bed. A pony-shaped lump was visible under the covers. It was moving. Its chest was rising and falling with each breath. Apple Bloom thought that she smelled something rotten and dusty, like a few pages of an old book, but she could have imagined it. Apple Bloom did not move, neither did the creature, save for its braving. Apple Bloom realized that the creature did not seem to realize that she was there. It did not stir as she stood frozen in the doorway, nor did the wind and rain seem to disturb it. Apple Bloom eventually left the room, quietly shutting the door behind her. She went back downstairs, slower this time, as to not make too much noise. Apple Bloom ended up spending the night in the barn. When her family returned and demanded an explanation, she made up a half-believable story about a burglar. She refused to return to the house until all the rooms had been searched. As Apple Bloom expected, no signs of a break-in were found, save for an open window in her bedroom. Apple Bloom returned to her bedroom after the search was complete. Other than a few dry leaves and the lingering smell of decay, there was no indication of anything having slept on her bed. However, Apple Bloom would found out that one of her dresses in the wardrobe was covered in dirt and what appeared to be a single bloody hoof print. Apple Bloom burned the dress in the fireplace later that day. Apple Bloom stayed up all night. She was sleepy to the point of near madness, but she refused to tear her eyes from the window. Fluttershy was watching her yet again. This time she held a single piece of ripped cloth in her mouth. It was from the dress Apple Bloom had burnt. Apple Bloom had buried the remains of it in the yard. Apple Bloom thought of the eyes in the shadows that seemed to have haunted her early foalhood. She was now convinced that she had heard scratching noises and perhaps tapping, but memories and nightmares had become interchangeable as of late. Apple Bloom was not wholly convinced that they were not one the same. The two sat locked in what seemed to be a staring contest until morning came. As soon as Celestia's light poked through its way into the clouds, Fluttershy turned and trotted away. Apple Bloom did not get up from her bed. It was minutes before she gave in to her slumber. Applejack had found the remains of the dress and demanded to know why Apple Bloom was burning her clothes. She also asked Apple Bloom about her apparent sleep troubles and her hostility towards Fluttershy. Apple Bloom confessed nothing. She made excuses that were far from plausible. Apple Bloom did not care if her sister was satisfied or not. A part of her hoped that Applejack would send her away, perhaps to a relative's house. At least Apple Bloom would be far away from this nightmare if that happened. But Applejack had not sent her away. Apple Bloom was certain that Applejack was consulting Big Macintosh over the matter. But for the time being, she was forced into a staring contest with Fluttershy, or whatever loathsome creature wore Fluttershy's face, outside her window. Fluttershy pressed her hooves against the window. Her eyes seemed larger than they should have been. They appeared mournful, as if denied some great conquest. Apple Bloom could only stare for so long before she turned away. Fluttershy mouthed out those familiar words again. "It's cold out here," she mouthed. Apple Bloom stuck her head under the covers. She did not hear Fluttershy tapping by the window, but at that mournful face that had taken over her thoughts. Apple Bloom thought she may have been sleepwalking the previous night, for she had not awakened in her bed and curled up in front of the closed window. Enough is enough, Apple Bloom thought, as she laid in bed. It may have been what seemed like a brave proclamation, but in truth Apple Bloom was terrified. She again did not sleep, and her eyes focused on the creature outside the window. Fluttershy returned Apple Bloom's stare, smiling and licking her lips. Earlier, Apple Bloom had overheard her siblings talking about doctors. She was aware that they had planned to send her to one. Whatever her siblings planned to do, Apple Bloom was confident her troubles would soon end enough. Apple Bloom opened her window at night, and she waited until the sun almost sunk in below the trees before she did so. Her family had dozed off a little while ago. Confident she was the only sleepless soul in the house, Apple Bloom left her bedroom and went downstairs. In the kitchen, Apple Bloom pounced on an old gas lamp. She took the sharpest kitchen knife that she could find from the drawer, far more useful than any garden hose she had chosen last time. But this time the purpose was to not mere defense. Apple Bloom waited until the darkness had truly fallen. Then she crept back to her room, the gas lamp held precautiously in one hoof, and the knife handle in her mouth. Apple Bloom nudged the door open inch by inch, careful to minimize any tiny noises she made. The creature was again lying in Apple Bloom's bed, the outline from its form underneath the covers. Apple Bloom placed a gas lamp on the floor, and she froze and touched it on the floorboards with the slightest thump. She saw no evidence of the creature awakening the sound. Apple Bloom did hold back a sigh of relief. Apple Bloom waited for a few more minutes as to a certain thing that was asleep. She approached the bed, knife still clutched tightly in her mouth. She was shaking but refused to hesitate for this moment of action. Apple Bloom reached to the side of the bed and gently pressed both hooves against it. She eased herself up, carefully pulling herself onto the bed next to the creature. Then the creature moved. It was only a slight shift, as if it was trying to get comfortable, but it was enough to completely destroy Apple Bloom's nerve. Apple Bloom dropped the knife, and a squeak of terror flying out of her mouth. She pressed both hooves against their mouth, but it was far too late. The creature seemed to sense Apple Bloom was near. It moved in one swift, jerky motion, arching its back and blinding its head in a way that no normal pony would have imagined. The creature gave a long growl. Its body appeared to convulse and threw the covers from it. Apple Bloom screamed and leaped from the bed. The creature leaped from the bed as well, moving in a similar way to a spider. It still resembled Fluttershy, but its neck was bent at an unnatural angle, as if it's broken. Its head was bent to one side upside down. It was regarded Apple Bloom with its upside-down grin, a grin extending far past of what looked to be possible. Its tongue hung limply from one side of its mouth, like that of an excited dog. It was panting in eagerness. Applejack was rushed to the room, gas lamp on in her hoof. "What in the hay is going on?" Applejack said breathlessly. But Apple Bloom could only whimper, pointed a hoof at the creature now stood in silent triumph near the window. Applejack's eyes widened at the amusement and horror. "What in tarnation?" Applejack gasped. The creature moved its neck again, adjusting its head to the more normal position. Its face no longer even vaguely resembled Fluttershy, but instead had morphed into some twisted mockery of Shy Pony's face. The mouth started to even stretch farther. The pupils were even smaller, like pinpricks. It was breathing heavily, and a tongue at least for a foot long, hanging from its gaping maw. Applejack tossed the gas lamp to the creature. It shattered on impact, settling a vile thing on fire. All at once, the creature's twisted face rearranged itself. It's now becoming even more accurate of representation of Fluttershy. The flames start to engulf her immediately. The scent, unlike that of sulfur, arose as patches of fur hastily burnt away. The creature objected loudly, alternating between screams and eerily similar to those of Fluttershy, and deep screeches, not like the one of a tortured bird. The fur and flesh burned away at an unnatural rate, the screams and screeches continuing long after they should have ended. The last to surrender was the inferno, was the pink and light pink mane. After a few moments, what all remained was a charred skeleton. Apple Bloom and Applejack did not speak to each other. Neither spoke a word of the incident, even after Applejack buried the body in the secluded part of the farm. In fact, they took a secret to their graves. Apple Bloom never once again slept with her window open, even practically on hot nights. Eventually, she was able to resume regular interaction with the real Fluttershy, although it took months before she could look her in the eye, and for a while at that, Apple Bloom would shudder every time Fluttershy smiled. The creature's smile would haunt her for the remainder of her days. Occasionally on nights when it's practically cold and the wind is close to howling, Apple Bloom will swear she hears tapping on the window, but she never gets up to check. She merely snuggles deeper into the covers, willing to herself and the dreamland quicker. But it seemed a little harder to ignore the voice. It whispers to her, seemingly inches away from her ear. It sounds very much like Fluttershy. "It's cold down here."